Hi, everyone. My name is Karina. I'm going to be talking about California's policy response to the COVID-19 pandemic as it relates to the public education system, K through 12. So my Culminating project is looking at the impact of the pandemic, and I'm focusing on these three areas here: enrollment, learning loss, and this broad category of funding. So when I refer to learning loss, I'm speaking directly about student test scores. And I just want to note that while standardized testing isn't always an accurate reflection of a student's ability or understanding of the material, it does give us a good pinpoint sort of where students are struggling the most academically. And then this broad category of funding relates to, I speak about both state and federal funding, general funding, but also COVID relief related funding. And of course, I can't talk about budgets without referencing the local control funding formula, which originally was enacted to provide flexibility for school districts to fund their schools depending on those students that demonstrated the most need. So looking at all of these areas, my problem statement focuses on the need for policymakers to undertake intentional efforts to try and make up this learning loss that I've addressed. And so a little bit more in depth about these areas. Prior to the pandemic, we saw a loss of 20,000 students. And after the pandemic, we saw that number balloon to 110,000. Now, this isn't specifically related to the pandemic. I do note here other possible reasons: migration, the availability of other charter schools, and homeschooling. But I think enrollment is important to address because it is directly related to funding, as the local control funding formula does take into account enrollment and attendance. And so prior to the pandemic, we were the LCFF was a concern because there was a significant drop in revenue, almost 30%. And so now, post-pandemic, there's not a lot of research specifically about how different school districts are being funded based on the LCFF. But we do know that in January, the governor's proposed budget for 2023-24 showed significant budget cuts, not just for the general school budget, but also for the one-time COVID relief funding spending. And then, of course, my the one that I'm most curious about was the learning loss. And that was because prior to the pandemic, fewer than half of K through 12 students were meeting the standards for reading and math. And after the pandemic, we saw those scores significantly drop by 7%. More importantly, I wanted to highlight those students that were third graders at the beginning of the pandemic and are now in sixth grade. A little less than half of them can actually read. So I think that's a really concerning point in which it highlights how important it is to develop policy alternatives to address that. And so my paper focuses on the application of the rational model framework. It's a 5-step process. So I define the problem, for my paper, I identified 2 potential policy options. And then based on the objectives and the goals of my paper, I chose 3 criteria here that I would like to evaluate both policy alternatives. And so one thing that I'd like to note here is sort of the difference between effectiveness and efficiency, which is often sometimes confused. So efficiency is the success by which an alternative is implemented based on the cost of implementation, while effectiveness is sort of looking at the alternatives success at addressing the central problem. So minor difference there. The 3 that I chose was equity, feasibility, and efficiency for my paper. And then so the next, we assessed the possible outcomes of the policy options, and then arrive at our final recommendation. So my two policy alternatives, the first one I like to call the collaborative strategy, would be a teacher-centered pilot program. And so this pilot program would assess a teacher, help train teachers assess learning loss depending on different factors that contribute to academic success, not just test scores, but looking at their demographics, at their age, at their mental health, all of these other aspects that also contribute to a student's success. And then my second alternative would be to reevaluate an existing policy, which is the local control funding formula. So considering that enrollment is declining, I think that amending the clause that would sort of negatively impact those school districts who are struggling to have students enroll or attend, it would significantly disadvantage certain school districts. So I think it's worth considering a reevaluation also of their accountability measures that they have in place. So both very important to address. And so in my analysis, considering the pilot program, I think that considering that it's not a statewide implementation, a pilot program would offer that cost relief. And it would also give us an opportunity to evaluate the success of the pilot program, which if those numbers are great, then would also garner political feasibility in the future for policy implementation. And then also, I thought equity was really important to address. I think that there's an important note of sort of training our teachers to not rely on a one-size-fits-all solution for all students. All students learn differently. And so I think it's important to recognize that. And so given all of this, my final recommendation is the one that I believe addresses learning loss the most efficiently, which is the collaboration strategy. Now, my paper doesn't focus specifically on implementation details, but I did look at pilot programs that were successful in the past and sort of took some of the most important components and applied them here. So with that concludes my presentation.
Questions for Karina?
Diane?
Oh.
Well, beautiful presentation, Karina. My question is regarding kind of what you were talking about right now towards the end. Were there specific programs that you were looking at when creating your two policy recommendations?
Yeah, so I did look at some pilot programs that were implemented during the pandemic. One of them was a tutoring pilot program, which saw a lot of success. It was implemented by Harvard University, and some of these components match that initial pilot program, which was transparency was key, and monitoring and evaluating that. But for like reevaluating the LCFF, I think that's it, the LCFF has in the past it's been amended, so I think reevaluating it to sort of address the current climate is something that is always part of the conversation. So there wasn't a specific program for that, as much as it was just background.
I would like to ask, how did you come up with your alternatives of the collaboration strategy and reconsidering the LCFF formula? Like, was that something you found like in your literature review, or just proposals already out there, or things that you developed yourself?
Yeah, so in my research, in trying to find a solution for this like ominous learning loss, I I ran into pilot programs in the past, but then also I sort of considered existing policies, like the LCFF, and sort of saw that, well, kind of determined that if enrollment is predicted to continue to decline, which it is, I think that anything that's related to, tied to funding as it relates to enrollment is important to address or reconsider. I think also in my own line of work, at the California School Board Association, we're sort of looking at all of these areas from different lenses, and we also do provide COVID relief fund explanations. So I think some of that is also inspired from work.